Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm Jay Daniels. If you've listened to our show over the past few weeks, you might have heard our next guest accompanying one of our featured vocalists. He's a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but these days, pianist John di Martino is recognized as a first-call musician in New York City. His latest project is a tribute to the music of Billy Strayhorn, Passion Flower. John's accompanied by a stellar group of musicians, including saxophonist Eric Alexander, bassist Boris Kozlov, and drummer Lewis Nash. Raul Midon is featured as a guest vocalist on the track Lush Life. Our story begins with John's early years in Philadelphia. Did you know that the piano was not his first instrument? Here to share his journey of musical discovery is John di Martino.
My mother just had her 90th birthday. My mother is a amateur singer. She never did it professionally, but I think I get a lot of my music talent and sensitivity from her because she had always had a tremendous ear. Like, you know, the time that I was studying with Lenny Tristano, and I was very into that, the Tristano school players who would never state the melody. They would just improvise on the tune. And I couldn't believe, without any musical training, she could listen to one of these recordings and start to sing the tune. She would hear the harmony, and she'd guess what the tune is. And I know trained musicians that have an issue with that. And I thought, wow, what an amazing ear. So I feel like there are things I got from her. She also, when she found out that I had an interest in jazz, I was about 12 years old, she started getting records for me. And my brother was a theater person, so there was always a lot of theater music in the house. So I grew up with a lot of theater music. So in that sense, it was musical, but there weren't other musicians.
Who were some of the first musicians that you heard? You mentioned theater music as well as jazz. You know, who were some of the artists that you were hearing during your childhood?
Well, my brother was always playing whatever the latest musical is. So I grew up with West Side Story. Still to this day, when I hear anything from West Side Story, I have a very strong emotional reaction, very strong. I feel connection with it. You know, ironically, through my work with Janis Siegel, I know his daughter, Jamie Bernstein, and I often talk about this with her. But I also remember growing up, for example, with Hair, you know. And,
yeah.
And ironically, you know, I live the town right next to Hoboken, and Jim Rado, the lyricist, he lives there. And I often run into him, and I like to pick his brain about stories. It's some fascinating stories about the whole evolution. And of course, that's considered the first rock musical. But I also, one that I remember listening to a lot is Gypsy. And also, I'm going blank, the one that actually starts the year I'm born, 1959, and it closed several years ago. The Fantastics. Yeah, the Fantastics, which is funny. It's the same age as me.
It's not too terribly old then.
Yeah, right.
Were there any jazz pianists that you heard when you were younger?
Yeah, the very first records I had, I remember having an MJQ record, listening to John Lewis and playing along with it, John Lewis and Milt Jackson. My mother, I remember, got me the Benny Goodman sextet recordings. That was one of the first things. One of the reasons why is before she met my dad, apparently she dated a guitarist. So she always had this affection for the guitar who kind of got her into listening to Charlie Christian. So I thought that was a great place to start. You know, my first instrument, I started studying when I was 12 years old, is violin.
Oh.
And at that time, we would sort of hunt for records of jazz violinists. There were very few. But my first experience with improvisation was playing the blues. And I would play blues on the violin and blues on the harmonica, the little blues harp.
Yeah.
And at that time, John Mayall was very popular. So I was listening to a lot of John Mayall and playing along. And I remember as a little 12-year-old kid, you know, on the back of the LPs, he would put what key the song is in to sort of help you out, to sort of find your way. And so blues was a very important part of my evolution. Like I feel like it's my foundation in a way that it was my first experience with improvisation and my first experience with understanding something about theory. And then, you know, and then from there, I started to fall in love with jazz, and I wanted to understand the more complex harmonic structures. And the funny thing is, I had a little friend that he played violin, and we'd just play for hours, you know, very primitive blues, ding, 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 ding. We'd take turns soloing. And I remember he had no interest in jazz or that more sophisticated harmony. And ironically, years later, he moved to Nashville and wound up playing with Leon Russell, and I went in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Do you still play violin by chance, John? I never knew that you dabbled in that.
No, if I pick it up in pizzicato, you would say, "Oh, John, you play violin." But if I pick up the bow, you'd put your hands over your ears and you'd say, "No, you don't play violin," because you know the whole thing of violin is the bow arm, which takes years and years to. But I did start. I remember somehow when I was really young, I played a little accordion, but I have no memory of that. And when I was about 7 years old, I think I dabbled with some drum lessons, but I didn't really keep that up. So it's like from 12 years old that the progression starts. And even then, I sort of fell away from the violin, and I'd play the piano as a hobby. And then somehow, I was about 15 years old, I started simultaneously to play with a little band, a wedding band, you know, nothing very high level, and study with a great teacher in Philadelphia named Jimmy Amadei. So I think my formal education starts with him, you know.
And was he a jazz instructor then? Yes.
Yeah, he's got a few books out, and very, very legendary teacher in Philadelphia.
He wasn't obviously the only teacher you had. In fact, you mentioned earlier Lenny Tristano. Who were some of the, not just teachers you actually took lessons from, but who were some of those mentors who might have given you inspiration along the way?
Oh, so many. In terms of mentors that I knew, like Bobby Tucker, who was the accompanist to, he only had 2 gigs his whole life, accompanist to Billie Holiday and accompanist to Billy Eckstine, you know, for many years. And Billy Eckstine would always introduce him that way. He says, he's only had 2 gigs in his whole life. He says, he thinks he's in show business. You know? But he was a mentor. God, there have been so many mentors. My years with Ray Barretto, I learned so much from him. I learned to shut up and listen to him because I'd be in the studio and he'd give me a directive and maybe I'd fight him on it, just my youthful folly. And then I started to realize, wow, this guy's got almost 100 CDs to his own name, and I think I can learn something from him.
Did you have any professional aspirations? I mean, when you're in your teen years, sometimes you're still trying to figure out what you want. But when you were that age, did you think, oh, this is something I'll do for a career, or did you have other plans in mind?
Probably by 15 years old, it seemed obvious that it was, for me, that it was a destiny, even though there's a period, I think when I was about 19, when I feel like I got a little regressive with it and maybe sort of retreated into a lot of irrational fear. Like I had gotten a scholarship to go to Berkeley in Boston, and I never went. But it seemed like, for some irrational reason, but it seemed like my destiny always kept bringing me back. Like I couldn't avoid it. So ironically, some years later, I think I was about 25. All that time I was doing gigs around Philadelphia, but I started to work in Atlantic City. I wound up having a house band gig at what was the Golden Nugget for 3 years. And the fascinating thing about that is it was kind of an anachronism. Here I was playing with a house trio in a lounge, okay? And every week we would accompany someone different. But this included like Billy Eckstein, Jack Sheldon, Fran Warren, like all the people that I used to see watching The Tonight Show, like in high school, Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show. Yeah. I got to work with so many of those people and I got to learn so much. And it was like, it ranged from the sublime to the ridiculous. And every style of music, I learned to not be a snob about different conceptual ways to approach music. So that wound up being my music school, which serves me really well because when I moved to New York, I had a wealth of experience, I think, to aid me in the situations I dealt with in New York.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what led you to move to New York? As far as I know, a lot of your family and most of your life had been spent around Philadelphia, and New York is not that far, but certainly it is a change in pace for many.
Oh, yeah, very much so. If I could go back in time, I wish I had just moved here when I moved to New York when I was 19 years old. One, maybe, I guess, somewhat dysfunctional thing, nobody's perfect, that I inherited from my teacher in Philly, Jimmy Almeida. He would always say, don't go till you're ready. And I realized that's the worst advice to give to a young person. The best thing is go and get beat up or as soon as possible. And, that's the old adage, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again. And it actually, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So I was in Atlantic City for 6 years before I moved to New York. And the last 3 years I was still busy, but I could feel everything drying up there. And it started to feel like I was in the most remote part of Alaska. And I eventually said, I got to get out of here and I got to move to New York. And I moved to New York in 88. And I was still running back to Atlantic City doing gigs. And I realized, wow, if I keep running back to Atlantic City and doing gigs, I'm never going to be really integrated into the New York scene. So I sort of had to burn some bridges to build some new ones,
As talented as you were and having learned so much, I mean, I would suppose in 88 were you the new kid on the block then in New York?
Well, like anybody, when you move to a new town, you do something that doesn't exist anymore, but it did exist then. Something in New York we call club dates. Club dates means private parties, weddings, bar mitzvahs. Okay, so I knew only one pianist because you have to understand, Atlantic City was a magnet place that back then in the early, a magnet for people in the music field back in the early 80s. So there was a constant influx of musicians from New York, from LA. In fact, everybody I know now somehow relates to this, germ period in Atlantic City, including like Freddie Cole. That's where I met Freddie Cole, which has been a long association. I've done like his last 10 records, on high note. So I knew one pianist, great pianist. His name is Gerard D'Angelo, who actually he moved out of the playing scene and he became primarily an educator. At the time, he had started to do a regular gig at the Rainbow Room. He had to sub out all his separate weekend dates, and he gave me all his weekend dates. And that's what sort of, because I remember doing club dates with people like, Randy Brecker, making all sorts of connections, It's not the kind of work that you list on your resume, but whatever you do that you're getting around people and you're meeting people in your community brings you more into the scene.
So let me ask you this, in developing your voice, in developing your resume, so to speak, in New York, what were some of the challenges that you experienced? I like to dig into the story of the artist to see some of the ways that they had to fall and get back up again. I'm sure that must have happened to you a time or two as well.
Oh, definitely. I would say perhaps my first year, I even thought, gee, what's it worth? Maybe I should just move back. I don't know, to Philadelphia. I don't know if I was going to move back to Atlantic City. I remember giving up, feeling like I would give up. But again, there always seemed to be this destiny pulling me back. Perhaps it's not until maybe 1992 that I did my first major jazz festival. And I kind of wish this wasn't the first one, because it's like the best one you could do. And I was so nervous. I would like to do it again now. It was the Berlin Festival. And I played in the Philharmonie, where the same place where Von Karajan was conducting many years ago. And that same year, I remember I played started playing in a major jazz club, was Fat Tuesdays, which is no longer existing. So there always seemed to be some kind of special perk that nudged me back. I wound up playing at the Rainbow Room, which was a gig that I sort of hated. It had a really upstairs, downstairs kind of vibe to it. And but I played with the American band and the Latin band. And the Latin band was playing, a whole lot of tangos and cha-chas for these elderly rich women with some young dancer for hire kind of situation. It was a little silly after a while, but I was in the company of some really legendary musicians in the Afro-Cuban scene. Victor Venegas, who was the original bass player with Mongo Santa Maria, Virgilio Marti, great percussionist who used to play with Patato Valdez, and the band leader, Mauricio Smith, amazing flute player from Panama. So playing with those guys actually got me into the Latin jazz scene. I started to play with Bobby Sanabria, and then from that I started to play with Ray Barretto, and the list goes on. So that became a whole amazing world for me, and I traveled all around the world with Ray Barretto. It was really fun.
So needless to say, even after those first couple of years, you didn't leave New York. You stayed there for a very long time.
Yeah, I stayed because this is 1988. But I do remember about the first year or change in thinking, gee, what's it all worth? Maybe I should just, forget this, I have to say, I don't feel like I was always the most, I think I can safely say this, aggressive person about my career. I feel like I let things come to me, which is both good and bad, but it seemed that there's an old parable that they say what's meant for you will always be there for you, So it's almost like I feel like my destiny, or, God was saying, hey, no, you have to do this, whether you like it or not. You have to do it. You have to realize this,
I think some people refer to it as a calling,
Yeah, I would say that. And it's just we get to a point where we say, like, well, let's stop fighting it. It's actually a great gift to be called to do something. Let's do it. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, it's amazing how these opportunities present themselves. And, you have worked with a number of great artists, as you mentioned. In addition, you have Gloria Lynn, Houston Person, Nikki Perrott. In the many years you've been working the New York scene, which, let's see, you moved there when I was born. So, that's a little while. But in all of those years, personally or professionally, what would you say has been your greatest success?
I always feel like that hasn't happened yet, but there's been a lot of high points. I started working with Grady Tate. I'll tell you, it's an interesting story how I met him. And in working with Grady Tate, I met producer Todd Barkin, and that led me to a whole lot of things. In fact, my big recording portfolio starts after that. A whole lot for Venus Records, Japan, my own records, and also as a sideman, and a whole lot of records for High Note, And it's bizarre how I met Grady Tate. I was doing a friend of mine, his name is Tim Wimette. He has a little sort of down big band, and I was doing a gig that I think paid like $20 or something with him in a little bar in somewhere in the Hell's Kitchen area. And there was like a broken keyboard there. It had no sustain pedal. There was a note that when you hit it in the middle, the note would just keep going. But apparently Grady Tate liked to drink in this bar. And they're like, hey, look up, there's Grady Tate, you know? And I said to myself, and the rhythm section was kind of interesting. I said, oh, I hope he doesn't sit in because this thing is terrible, you know? And if he does sit in, I hope he doesn't want to do a ballad because, oh my God, the sustain pedal doesn't work. I got to do it. So anyway, he comes in and he says, he does sit in and he says, I'm going to do, I'm as restless, you know.
It might as well be spring.
Might as well be spring.
Rodgers and Hammerstein.
He said, but I want to start just you and I, rubato. And I'm like, oh God. Anyway, so we get through it. And at the end, he says to me, he says, I felt the way you accompanied me. He said, you held me in your hands. And he was a little bit drunk. And I'm thinking, oh boy, yeah, he's drunk and he's just, you know, chattering. And he said, will you record with me? I said, well, I would love to record, but I'm thinking, you know, he's drunk and he's just saying whatever's off the top of his head. So a week later, I get a call from a Japanese woman who's recording, organizing a recording. Yes, we have you. So, it actually was a recording where actually Kenny Barron played piano, but I played keyboards and I did some arrangements, and that started my whole association with Grady Tate, which, like I said, but it's funny. It was a $20 gig that I begrudgingly went to. You know, I didn't really want to play this broken keyboard. So my advice to like young musicians is do everything. Don't feel you're above everything because you never know where your opportunity lies. What do they say? 50% of life is showing up, you know?
Yeah. And I want to talk with you about your album that's just released. It's called Passion Flower, and it includes some new interpretations of Billy Strayhorn works. You've actually recorded some of these before on previous albums. How did this project come about, wanting to honor Strayhorn?
I had been doing, for a couple of years, for, 3-4 years now, concerts of all Strayhorn, but specifically with the great maestro Paquito de Rivera playing clarinet. And so part of the novelty of the situation is also Paquito playing this repertoire, which he fell in love with, and also hearing it on the clarinet, because a lot of these compositions are originally features for Johnny Hodges, alto saxophone, and one of the last concert that we did was at Flushing Town Hall in Queens. And the producer, Neville Gruz, he's a dear friend of mine, originally from South Africa, but he's been here for many years. He has a business here. I had mentioned to him that we were keen to record this music because the very first gig that I did with Paquito was at the Jazz at the Kitano, in Manhattan.
Yes. And
I remember Paquito saying, we should record this music. So Neville said, hey, I'd like to produce the recording. So that's what made all this come together. In fact, in the thank yous, I thank Miss Ellen Kodadek, who books the music at Flushing Town Hall, because it was that gig that sort of was the conduit that brought all these things together. I've had a long love of Strayhorn's music. It goes back to, I mentioned in the liner notes, I was 15 years old, and an older cousin said, I'd love to hear you play Lush Life. He was actually one of the older cousins that was feeding me a lot of jazz records. In fact, he used to let me raid his record collection, which was like, lined up a whole wall, and I would just take records out, and he sort of had something from everybody. It was like being at the record store, As it turned out, logistically, somehow it didn't work out that we were going to do it with Paquito. So I got Eric Alexander, who, as you know, is no slouch. He's an amazing player.
And a lot of Strayhorn's music, I am not a scholar on his work. I know that Lush Life he wrote at a very young age. And a lot of these, he was relatively young compared to a lot of artists. there's a certain depth that I find in Strayhorn's music that I don't find from other artists. Would you say you find some of that same depth in his record or in his compositions?
Oh, definitely. You hear, there's an influence from Gershwin, but you also hear a kind of impressionism that almost moves. Of course, he was very attuned to all things French. He spoke French. When I think about what's quintessential Strayhorn is this sort of beautiful, rich perfume that the harmony has, and this exotic sense of melody. He was very young when he wrote Lush Life, and it's so nice. I've gotten some really good feedback from Billy Strayhorn Songs, which is an organization that's led all by nieces and nephews of Billy Strayhorn. They've been very happy about the project, so it's nice to get that feedback.
How do you feel these particular works that you have included, these Strayhorn works, how do you feel they are relevant to today's climate?
I think a lot of them can be like a soothing balm for this time, this turbulent time that we live in. But they're also, I feel like a lot of them, they're just eternal musical vehicles from a jazz perspective that can always be re-explored. Like I always find something new. For example, I have an arrangement of Flowers of Love, something that I did on a trio recording, but I wanted to re-examine it again. I did it as a solo piece here because I played it in a totally different way. And I think this is a quality of really deep, great music. It's like a person. You always discover something new. They're kind of like personalities, You find something new that you didn't see before.
And in the case of some Strayhorn songs, they were not originally written with lyrics. Some were, some weren't. But yet there is an unmistakable quality, and I don't know if I would use the word serendipitous or what, but certainly the fact that he worked with Ellington for so long, I think that gave rise to the prominence of Strayhorn's music.
Oh, totally. Some people, there's the argument that, Duke shared publishing with, a lot of tunes that maybe Billy Strayhorn only wrote, but the reality is without Duke Ellington, the sad fact may have been that Strayhorn may have just faded into the obscurity of Pittsburgh, and we may not know about him. So, again, destiny at play, I think, Duke brought him out of Pittsburgh, and it's the reason why we feel his influence so strongly. David Haydu, Strayhorn biographer David Haydu, he came to my photo session and he brought some artifacts. In fact, there's a picture of him underneath the CD. It's just somehow the text got omitted. It says, with David Haydu, and he brought some scores in Strayhorn's hand, which we used in the graphics, and also he had the original published copy of Lush Life, which I also used that in the graphics. Yeah, so it's kind of nice. Also, he was able to give me some use of some archival photos of Strayhorn.
I think that's wonderful. And just when you think that you know all that you can know, there is still so much more to learn in music, isn't there?
Oh, totally. It never stops. It never stops.
I have one last question for you, John, and I think you've already given a great answer to it throughout the interview, but if I can ask just in 2 words, one last question. Why music?
I don't know. I've just always been musical, and that's one of the ways my own creativity manifests. But I don't know. I also love language and lyric. I also love film. I'd like to get more involved in film. I scored a film a couple of years ago, and I'd love to do more of that. That's the other thing I'm as passionate about as music,
John di Martino, our guest this week during In Studio from Simply Timeless. The name of the album is Passion Flower, and you can find it wherever quality jazz music is sold. More information at johndimartino.com. Thanks to John for taking the time to meet with me, and especially for sharing his music with us. Until we meet again, I'm Jay Daniels. Thanks for joining us in studio.